What if the smartest investment opportunity of our time was not just about generating profits, but more importantly about future-proofing our economy while fostering prosperity, equity, and well-being? Nature underpins over half of global GDP, a staggering $44 trillion. But here's the catch. Our financial systems are still struggling to recognize its true value. So, how can businesses, investors, and policymakers start integrating nature into their decisions? What's driving the business case for biodiversity? And how do we scale nature-positive investments in a way that benefits both people and the planet? In this episode, we discuss these questions with leaders in finance, business, and activism. Welcome to the Geneva Connection. I'm Luca Bernacchi. Let's begin. NatureFinance is not just about conservation. It's a $1 trillion economic opportunity waiting to be unlocked. But to make it happen, businesses and financial systems need to see nature as a core asset, not a burden. What is the business case for nature? To set the stage, we sat down with Mark Halle, a senior advisor at NatureFinance. Hello, Mark. Great to have you on the podcast. Let's dive into the business case for NatureFinance. The World Economic Forum estimates that nature-positive investments could unlock $10 trillion in business opportunities by 2030. That's a huge number. But to start, can you break it down for us? What exactly is NatureFinance and what kinds of investments are we talking about?
Thanks for inviting me. Nice to be here. You started with something very interesting. You started with NatureFinance as a huge business opportunity. And most people think of NatureFinance as the need to find somewhere the money to save what's left in a declining world. And that sort of negative approach to NatureFinance has never really worked. Now, we do need to find more money to meet conservation priorities. But the key thing, I think, is to look at nature integrated into financial activity, integrated into business activity as an opportunity, as a step towards the future that we want to see. So when we talk about NatureFinance, we talk about aligning the financial system much better with the requirements of a nature-positive economy. And so it's more a question of how you integrate nature into financial activity, into business activity, so that you get a better result both for business and for the planet.
There's been a lot of momentum around NatureFinance lately, especially after the Biodiversity COP in Cali. It seems like businesses are starting to look beyond carbon credits and seriously consider investing in nature. How do you see this trend evolving and what are the biggest challenges here?
So I think what you're seeing and what we saw in Cali, where there were over 1,000 participants from the financial sector, this is only the second climate biodiversity COP in which there was a substantial presence of financial and business people. I think what you're seeing is a convergence of the climate agenda and the nature agenda. Now, I think most people know that the single greatest cause of climate change is actually agriculture and land transformation, and probably the most promising and cost-effective means of addressing climate change would be to invest in nature, in regeneration of lands, regeneration of ecosystems, restoration agriculture, and so on. So there is increasingly a tendency to look at these two issues together as inseparable, but also where an investment in one leads to good results in the other. So I think that's the first thing that you're seeing. I think the second thing that you're seeing is that business has understood that if we continue to degrade nature, we will be undermining the business models that they work on. And so nature risk is suddenly being taken a great deal more seriously. And a part of nature risk is what we call nature dependency. In other words, your business model, your value chain, to what extent does it actually depend on water still flowing or access to natural resources that you have now, but you might not have 5 years from now if it degrades? So the notion of nature risk and dependency is being joined by a notion of nature impact. How can you do your business without damaging the nature on which your whole business model depends? So I think we're seeing both those things, and therefore a wish by business to see put in place a framework that gives them predictability. saying that, okay, this is what we agree, we'll implement this, and so we know what our business environment will look like over the next 5-10 years. And that allows us to invest with some confidence.
You mentioned that the nature agenda is catching up with the climate agenda, but how do we make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes?
Firstly, I hope that we learn from mistakes that we made. Climate started earlier as a political priority, and therefore, in a sense, has several years of advance on the biodiversity agenda. But the biodiversity agenda is catching up, and as it catches up, it tries to avoid the mistakes that were made in climate, many of them which have been corrected, but that lost us some time. So to take the example of carbon credit markets, voluntary carbon credit markets, everybody thought this was a wonderful idea, but the way it was implemented left lots of loopholes that unscrupulous people used to make money very quickly without actually pulling a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. And we want to make sure that that doesn't happen in the case of biodiversity. Biodiversity, of course, is more complicated because you don't have that single metric of the ton of carbon that everybody understands, but it's a much more complex set of metrics, and the impacts really are all very local. And so we're trying to avoid making the mistake, learn from the case of carbon credit markets, and do things better with biodiversity.
Measuring impact is a huge challenge when it comes to nature investments. Unlike climate, where we have clear CO2 metrics, biodiversity is much more complex. So how do we measure the impact of these investments?
So first of all, you have to have a robust and trustworthy baseline. So let's say today, this is the situation, and you measure it, you look at the biodiversity that's there, you look at the situation, and then your credit is based on what we call a biodiversity uplift. So you invest in restoring nature, you invest in protecting nature, biodiversity improves, and it's the measure of that improvement that gives you the basis for the currency that is the biodiversity credit.
Let's focus on technology for a moment. Technology and innovation are transforming climate finance. What about nature finance? What are some of the most exciting developments you're seeing?
So very much so. And it's a world that's happening very, very quickly. If you look at the startup community, for example, in Switzerland, but also worldwide, the number of startups that are linked to nature or nature-related technology is absolutely enormous. What we've seen is the emergence of nature markets, or markets that value and trade in nature. And that's going beyond that now, particularly at the political level, in what we call the emergence of the bioeconomy. And the bioeconomy is everything from trading in natural goods to, biocements or biopharmaceuticals or alternative proteins and so on. So that there's a whole technology agenda out there that, if successful, would lower the negative impact of business activity on nature, and in fact value nature in such a way that it would be worth investing in its health rather than simply exploiting what it has as commercial value. So I think if you look at last year's G20 presided by Brazil, Brazil introduced the notion of a bioeconomy. Now, Brazil is a nature-rich economy, so the more nature is valued in our economy, the better it is for countries like Brazil. Now, South Africa this year has picked it up again and is taking it forward as a basis also of interest for the whole African continent. So what I think we're seeing is that technology developments are allowing us to build business models around nature and the responsible exploitation of nature as a new source of income for the economy. And we think that a country like Switzerland is very, very well placed because of its research community, because its whole economy is based on high value production. It has a strong technological center community, and of course, it has a very favorable startup support mechanism. So we think that this is going to take off considerably in the next few years.
Many people, nature finance is a relatively new topic, and you've worked in this space for many years now. What are the biggest lessons you've learned from working in nature finance? And what are key takeaways that businesses and policymakers should keep in mind as they move forward?
So I think it's a bit what you started with and that I picked up on, which is that if you talk today to your average bank, your average investor, your average business, you say, what do you think of nature as, part? They will tell you, oh, it's a huge burden. We're just coming out from under the huge weight of climate compliance regulations where we've had to build whole new departments. And now you're telling us that we have to disclose, we have to report on nature, we have to comply with this. We're going to spend all of our time reporting and none of our time doing business. So in a sense, if you look at it through a compliance lens, nature is perceived negatively from a business point of view. If you look at it through an opportunity lens, you say that those who actually integrate nature into their models most quickly will have a first mover advantage and start taking profit from a very, very rapidly expanding field. And it covers everything, as I said before, from production in ways that are friendly to nature to the highest technological developments. And it's not just how to use nature or use alternatives to nature where nature is rare. It's also the whole sort of service industry around it. It's the measurement, it's the metrics, it's the data. And businesses are springing out right, left, and center that offer these services. And I think that what it amounts to, and this is the lesson I would learn, is that 5 years ago, if you said you should integrate nature, people would say, yeah, we're interested, but we don't know how. Where's the data? Where are the definitions? Where can I find this? Where are the models that I could follow? Now, what has emerged is what we call the NatureFinance operating system. So that whole foundation has been put in place and is more and more sophisticated so that anybody who wants to take advantage of nature in their business models can now move forward with confidence and much more quickly. So in business, it's always the same. If you make it easy, people will follow that lead. If you make it incredibly complicated, they'll leave it for tomorrow.
Mark, thank you very much.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Nature is the life support system of our planet. Yet we've treated it as limitless, exploiting it for profit without ever accounting for its true value. At the same time, 85% of the world's largest companies depend heavily on nature for their direct operations. So, what's the private sector's role in valuing nature? We had the pleasure of speaking with André Hoffmann, Vice Chairman of Roche Holding and co-founder of Intent, about the new nature-positive approach to business, central theme of his new book, The New Nature of Business. André, welcome to our podcast. You advocate for integrating nature into business and rethinking its role in corporate strategies. So, let's start with a big question. The global economy depends on nature services, yet biodiversity loss is accelerating. Why do you think we've struggled to truly value nature?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the podcast. I think the answer to your question can be separated into a couple of different things. One of the important considerations about ignoring nature is because we forget to realize, or we omit to realize, that nature is nothing else than the life support system on Earth. Nature is life, and there's not much we can do if we don't have life around. But in reality, we underestimate nature because we consider it as being limitless. But at the same time, we use it to create value. So you take a public good, nature, which belongs to everybody, you use it for your own purpose, and it becomes profitable. Of course, it's a gross simplification, but the idea that nature has a value is starting to become absolutely obvious because we are getting to the limit of the planetary boundaries. We are seeing a change in climate that is not explainable by anything else than human interference. We are seeing limits in certain types of resources. We are seeing the results of industrial production and pollution. We're seeing more and more angst and anger among the young generation, which I think is a very important factor to consider when we talk about the long-term agenda. The capital that we use to produce the prosperity we have at the moment is suddenly showing its limits. And so that's one of the reasons why we need to identify or invent a new prosperity, which will not just be based on consumption, but will be based on regeneration. So moving away from extraction and pollution towards regeneration.
In your book, The New Nature of Business, you highlight how the relentless chase for short-term profits has come at the expense of long-term value. So what's the fix? Do we need a major mindset shift in how we do business? Or is it more about making big systemic changes?
I think the real key is the definition of success. As long as success is only filling up the bank account, so as long as we measure our activity, in particular as business people, only on the short-term profit maximization, this is systemically making it difficult to concentrate on the long term. For me, it's very much a question of risk. If I get involved into any transaction, I need to manage the risk element that I generate through this transaction, that I generate through these activities. What are the consequences of what I'm doing? And if I ignore these consequences, what Milton Friedman famously called externalities, if I ignore the externalities, making business simple. I just buy at a small price and I sell at a big one and the margin is mine. But the reality is that these externalities are now, not since a long time, since about 20 years' time, they're starting to come and hit us really. If you need to re-internalize the externalities, the profit and loss account looks very different. That's where most businesses today have to look at the risks of the future when they're taking asset allocation decisions.
Speaking of which, you've been very vocal about adding nature to company balance sheets. What's the best way to do that? And what are the biggest obstacles in your view?
I've been advocating for this notion that we are not using the right accounting system. We are focusing on costs, which are measurable. But costs is only capturing one part of the whole value creation business. We are avoiding talking about the externalities. So we need to understand the impact that our actions have. And this impact can be measured onto the three big capitals that unite us on the planet. One is the social capital, us together. Why is 1 + 1 often more than 2? Why do we congregate? Why do we do things together? Why do we care for our neighbor? This social capital is a very strong resource of humanity, which a number of other species on the planet do not have. So that's something that's worth looking at. The second one is the human capital. Very simple question. Are we happy? Are we getting to the point where we can actually self-realize? Can we contribute in a way that's meaningful to the others and to ourselves? Or are we just interested into short-term profit maximization for our own sake? Are we just interested into the instant satisfaction, instant gratification, or do we want to think the long term? And then the third one, of course, is nature. Nature, the natural capital, which is the life support system on Earth. Without this, there is no life. Without this, there is no humanity either. If we can put together an accounting system which will measure the impact we're having on these three capitals, and in particular the interdependency of these three capitals, how does social influence nature, how does nature influence human, etc., if we can put that into a reporting formula, we will at long last have the decision tool we need to allocate resources in the right way. At the moment, the emphasis is very much on reporting, which is the end of the process. But we need to bring it further. We need to make sure that we have a tool to decide how we really are going to do business going forward. That's the best way of making sure that we don't abuse one of the capitals in the benefit of the other. Now, these three capitals and their interdependencies eventually result into a transactional value. And that transactional value is what we should capture. It will be very different if we do that after having considered the free capital, or if we do this just on looking at the financial capital.
Let's talk about the practical side. Sustainability teams are already swamped with carbon accounting, endless disclosures, and a sea of acronyms. How do we get businesses to take action on biodiversity without drowning them in more red tape and bureaucracy?
If I look at the way capitalism functions, capitalism is three big actions. One action is where do I put my time, my energy, my know-how, my expertise, my talent, and my money as well, of course. How do I decide where to put it? Once I've taken that first original business decision, I need to manage risk. And if I want to manage risk properly, I need to think about the future. I need to think about the consequences on my setup of the decision I've taken. The third one, which is the one that really hurts us most, is this idea of competition. And, asset allocation, risk management, competition are the three tenets of capitalism. And competition has been for years seen as a way of improving the efficiency of the system because, it keeps you on your toe. You have to compete. You have to make sure that you're as good as the neighbor. The reality is that if you compete, the one who wins in the current system is the one who brings the lowest possible price. And that means competition drags us down because the market is not always right. Sometimes there are things that you need to do differently. And so you need regulation. The idea of bringing in new regulation and new reporting and new ways of standardizing information is not about trying to annoy the SMEs or try to annoy small business. It's to try to create a level playing field where we can compete on quality, on long-term thinking, and not just on price. Regulation is on its way. We've seen it happening at the European level. We've seen the International Financial Reporting System producing the ISSB standard. They have understood that they need to do something a little bit different and have introduced a set of standards which can be used by companies to report on impact. These are known as the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Board. Humanity is not asking more accountability from businesses, they're asking for a level playing field. How can we together contribute to the common good?
And that brings me to the big picture. Business often treats climate and nature as separate issues, but in reality, they're deeply interconnected. Does this separation limit our approach? Should we start treating them as one, even in terms of reporting?
Yes, so the idea that we do have a reporting system based on metrics that we all understand, finance, the accounting system that gives us indication of everything, has encouraged this sort of linear thinking. And if you're looking for an enemy in front of you, you can see the climate is changing. What do? You look at something that you can measure as a performance. The whole system has suffered a lot because we have over-privileged one of the variables. We have focused just on profitability. Now we're going to say we are going to only look at CO2 levels because that or at climate change gas emissions to do something. And that's easy to do. And we all like things that are simple and easy and transparent. But it's not going to be enough. We are talking here about incredibly complex systems which are multifactorial and which have a lot of collateral damages. For any scientist, if you ask them about a multifactorial equation, they will warn you into making sure that you keep it as open as possible. If you focus just on one instinct, you get surprising results. You get into the tipping point, the irreversibility points, the negative feedback loops. I mean, you go into all sorts of complex consequences of over-privileging one variable. And that's what we're doing with CO2. We're starting the same mistake as we did when we only looked at profit. That's dangerous. And for me, the underlying biosystem, which are below it, biodiversity, nature, ecosystems, we can use a lot of vocabulary. I prefer, as I said before, the word life, because that's what we're talking about. Is an important way of dealing with the damage made to the planet. Even if we talk in terms of CO2, well-functioning ecosystems, biodiverse environments are better at absorbing carbon than the ones we're using at the moment to just planting trees. There's an example I like to quote, is the example of the blue whales. A blue whale in its lifetime will capture 33 tons of CO2. And then it dies and it goes to the bottom of the sea, the CO2 stays there. The oak tree, which is one of the most spectacular trees we can think of and very good at capturing carbon, over a period of 500 years, which is its expected lifespan, will capture 10 tons. There's a balance there, which I find very interesting. By the way, there are about 3,500 blue whales left. There used to be 350,000. And so if we were able to restore this population to the same level, we would capture so much carbon. It's not a reason for doing it, but it is a collateral benefit, if you want.
There are some interesting tools and innovations emerging to help businesses measure, value, and protect nature. What's caught your eye recently, and how do you see AI playing a role in this space?
Well, of course, measuring nature is one of the most complex facing us, and that's one of the reasons why we've been neglecting it, because very often we've been entering into management activities which have resulted in things which surprised us. Every single ecosystem I can think of is different and is very complex and it's dynamic. So we need a lot of data formatted in a way that is easily understandable, and we need to repeat that measure very often if we want to understand the movement of biodiversity. So there are a couple of new technology involved into measuring circulating DNA, either in the air or in the water, which would allow us to zoom down into what biodiversity really is in certain parts of the planet. Because if we want to measure biodiversity, we also need to do it in a dynamic way, not just in a static way. It's humongous amounts of data points. We need AI to make sense of this. In my youth, we measured biodiversity with rubber boots and binoculars. We went out in the field, counted birds, and then we decided if the system was biodiverse or not. Today, that's of course not possible anymore. especially because it focuses on vertebrates and not on the invertebrates, which are much more important in terms of biodiversity than vertebrates themselves. The whole fauna, which is underground, bacteria, worms, krills, these are just not captured by our current technology. It's literally terra incognita.
You've spoken about the need to make nature a mainstream topic, and that really stuck with me. In one of your keynotes, you highlighted how we often avoid talking about nature. And indeed, we may too often see it as distant or just take it for granted. So my question is, how do we shift that mindset? How do we inspire the next generation of leaders, investors, and policymakers to see nature as foundational to business and society?
But first, to come back to the beginning of your, and thank you for quoting my speech. When I first started in business, I was already a member of the World Wide Fund for Nature. And I asked my business colleagues, guys, what do we do for nature? And the answer was very often, don't be ridiculous. Nature is in the Amazon. Nature is in the Camargue. Nature is on top of the mountain. It's not here. We're here, we're in the boardroom. We make business. We are professional. So nature does not come into our consideration about making value. And that sort of macho attitude, the sort of violence towards the environment, is something that has continued over the years. Also, people are convinced that you can continue to create value out of nature without caring for its future, although we are obviously reaching planetary limits, as we said at the beginning of this conversation. So I would say that attitude is slowly changing, but it is still a stigma. In public, if you speak about nature, it's because you don't wash, you're only interested in birds, and you don't understand the reality of life. The reality of life is making money and spending it as quickly as possible. And I think that's something that is hopefully changing, and that's something that we do need to change. As an employer, I can see that a number of the people who come to work for us ask in their recruitment process not questions which are based on how much will I get, but are more and more based on, how much free time will I get? Can I go and do something else? Or why am I coming to you? What's the purpose of your company? How can I contribute? And these are questions that in my generation didn't ask. But now, if you want to go to the next step, and how do we convince the younger generation that we need to include nature, I think that there is one major element. Well, first of all, when has it become acceptable that you forget your principles in order to make money? If you look at history behind us, when has it become okay to no longer be decent? If you really follow the notion of the business of business is business, companies are there to make money and nothing else, then you have to come to the point that making a profit is more important than what's around the profit-making mechanism. And you have to go into this mindset, which I wouldn't say is immoral, but is amoral. You just don't think about the consequences. You know there are some, but you don't think about it. And you get into this sort of schizophrenia where you have to do things that you shouldn't be doing, and you know you shouldn't, but you do it because you think that's what society and humanity expects from you. How can you be happy? I mean, that's the biggest destruction of human capital I can think of. We need to make sure that we qualify that in the right way. So I hope that the young generation, the people coming into the workforce now, are realizing that what's expected from them is not to make money in order to make prosperity which will liberate us, but it's more to make money in a way which will allow a sustainable prosperity. And that means taking into account planetary limits on a daily basis. I think the young generation is much more aware of that than my peer group is.
But here's the thing, business education hasn't really evolved. We're still teaching the same old economic and corporate models. What needs to change in higher education to help shape a new business mindset for the future?
Absolutely. And that's why I think new accounting is so important. We do need impact accounting so that future managers can manage in a way which will bring more benefits to all. Human capital has a lot to do with being happy. Being happy means contributing. Nobody's happy on his own. If you go at home and you watch television and you drink a bottle of good wine, it's not fun on your own. You want to share, you want to talk to people, you want to touch the flesh. And you can do that if you do not get involved into some sort of community thinking.
Yes.
As a manager, you're not there to satisfy shareholders, you're there to satisfy the community. The name company comes from the Latin compane, eating bread together. It's somehow this idea of the only way to be successful in business is to satisfy the shareholder has destroyed the planet. So if you want to restore the planet, if you want to regenerate it, we can use the same sort of genius if you measure impact first. Yeah? So if you don't look only at capital gains, but also at nature gains, we can do a lot with enterprise. It has to be done in the right spirit, in the spirit of a new definition of success.
Before you wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, thousands of things. I just would like to encourage our listeners to make sure that we don't just sit on our hands and do nothing. This is a problem that concerns us all. When I speak to people around me about we need to do something, people tell me, oh, come on, it's the Chinese, it's the Americans, it's big business, it's the capitalists. We can't do anything. Yes, you can at every single step of the way. It's not a question of consuming less, although consuming is a power, but it's a question of just thinking about the other.
André, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Indigenous communities protect 80% of global biodiversity, yet they receive less than 1% of climate funding. What needs to change, both in funding structures and decision-making, to ensure NatureFinance becomes a genuine tool for empowerment? In this segment, we hear from Xiye Bastida, an Indigenous climate activist and co-founder of the Re-Earth Initiative. Hi, Xiye. Welcome to our podcast. You're not just a youth climate activist, you're also a voice for Indigenous communities who are at the front lines of protecting our planet's biodiversity. You often highlight the need for systemic change over individual actions when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. And here's a stark example of where the system is failing. Despite safeguarding much of the world's biodiversity, Indigenous and frontline communities receive only a fraction of climate funding. How do we change that?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to participate. And you're absolutely right. Indigenous communities, we steward most of the world's biodiversity, but it's also a fight. And I think that's what really needs to be understood. Why do we need funds to protect what we have been protecting for thousands of years for free? No resources needed to protect biodiversity. Now we are confronting lots of extractivist industries, from loggers to miners to fossil fuel extraction, agriculture, massive deforestation, and also impacts of the climate crisis, such as wildfires and floods and stronger storms. All of these things cost a lot of money. If you are given the option of either selling your land because you need money and the loggers are coming in versus defending it and restoring it, it needs to have a value in today's world. And I think that's really sad, but it's also the reality. It's what's necessary. And lots of money when we see the crisis in the Amazon rainforest of a wildfire. Right now, it's seen as charity to give money to Indigenous communities, not as a vital solution of how we can regulate the whole Earth system, protect the biodiversity that is so integral to our life on this planet. And it's also seen as a one-way transaction, where if we donate money to an Indigenous community, it's like, oh, we did our part. But the important thing is also that reciprocity of listening. What solutions are we bringing as Indigenous communities for the world? What type of thinking are we bringing? What type of philosophy are we thinking? Anywhere from thinking intergenerationally to knowing in ecosystem specific, how do we restore that piece of land? How do we create biodiversity? A lot of people, we think of humans as the type of beings that can only come and build concrete things. But we also build biodiversity. A lot of people don't know that the Amazon rainforest, the soil of it, is actually some of the most infertile land in the world. And it was over the process of 4,000 years of Indigenous land stewardship and land management that enough topsoil was created for the Amazon rainforest to exist today. All of the biggest and most biodiverse national parks in the US exist because of Indigenous land management. The Yasuni Park in Ecuador has more biodiversity in it than all of the US and Canada combined. And this is because there were people on the land picking seed by seed what would be the most biodiverse spot on the earth. And if we don't understand that, as in the Western world, if we don't embrace that, our societies are going to be void of nature and of the biodiversity that makes nature resilient. So it's so important that we see this as a two-way street, investment on one side and learning on the other. Climate justice is the idea that not only are people affected differently by the climate crisis, by the impacts of the climate crisis, but also by the industries that are creating this crisis. And I think when we expand the concept of regeneration, not only to people, but to ecosystems, we go way beyond anything that we had learned was a solution. So sustainability was taught to us as a solution, and it's just a way of ignoring the actual harm we're doing.
Do you think the private sector, big businesses, and financial institutions are truly ready to embrace regeneration? Or is their focus on sustainability the best we can hope for?
They are definitely thinking about regeneration. And I can tell you that they're definitely thinking about regeneration. And I can tell you that the biggest companies in the world are already reaching out to us to ask how they can do this better. So Google, Apple, Nike, even the biggest banks, we are going into their advisory rooms and their boardrooms, and they're asking us what our generation is thinking, what they should be doing. They're bringing in scientists. I know a few, nobody has favorite scientists. I do. Some of my favorite scientists are serving in these advisories. For example, Netflix has an advisory board that I'm also part of. And if the biggest companies are doing it, first of all, they have resources to know what they need to know, what they want to know. But it is a signal to me, to every other company, that if the biggest ones are doing it, they're ahead. And I know that they care about knowing and competition and all of these things. It's so clear to me if the biggest, most successful companies are at the forefront of knowing and reaching out, not only to the climate movement, but climate activists, is because we're bringing in a perspective that is going to be very valuable for the future. Anywhere from what operations are to what the type of storytelling and the narrative should be. And I think, honestly, a really big part of why they do it is they want to avoid greenwashing and they want to show that they actually care. And I don't really care what their reason is for including us. What they care is that they're doing it and that it can work and that they can shift one thing in their whole supply chain and reduce carbon or make somebody's job fairer. Yeah, I mean, the companies are doing it. I think it's about how much the whole business sector embraces it.
You're the co-founder of the Re-Earth Initiative, a youth-led movement that's making real impact. Can you tell us more about your mission and how you're helping redistribute resources to young climate leaders on the ground?
Re-Earth Initiative is a youth-led organization that was born out of the COVID pandemic. I basically couldn't stay at home and do nothing. That's what it means. And we have now 59 people from over 27 countries in the organization. And last year, we regranted. That's one of our main missions, to redistribute knowledge and resources. And that is in the form of grants, in the form of toolkits, workshops, capacity building, anything so that youth can be empowered, fulfill their projects, regenerate their own ecosystems, and also have a voice in international spaces. Last year, we regranted $250,000, which for us, I mean, we managed a budget before of $2,000. So to get to this is a real milestone. I am so proud. And I hear people here talking about, I manage a $6 billion portfolio. And I'm like, we're getting there. But it's so important to me because out of all climate funding, youth-led nonprofits get 0.76%. So we basically get a drop off the drop because climate funding is not even that big in the world of philanthropy. And I think my nonprofit is one of the youth nonprofits that gets the most funding. And we don't want to keep that. We want to make sure it makes it to the ground. Because if we're asking that of the UN, if we're asking that of the big multilateral banks and everybody, we have to show that it's possible. But nobody's looking at the applications of the youth that won $5,000 for the year because it's too time consuming for a big foundation to do so. So we are redirecting that money and doing that work. And In the next year, we're about to launch cycle 2 in January of 2025. So we're very excited about being able to continue this program for another year. And we also do lots of narrative work. We want to change the narrative of the climate crisis, that youth from the global south also care about solutions. Maybe we cannot strike in our countries because in some of our countries it's illegal to actually go on the streets and strike. But we are doing everything we can to change the situation of our cities and our environments.
Xiye, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Join us for the next episode where we'll explore how finance can drive a more equitable and resilient society. From tackling systemic inequalities to expanding financial inclusion and bridging the global SDG funding gap, we'll discuss practical solutions and bold reforms shaping the future of finance for all. So tune in, and if you enjoy our podcast, hit subscribe. Bye for now from Geneva.